Bones. Ooh. I take back Andrew. No. All right. So we're in 2 Kings 13, and we're looking at really the end of Elisha's life. And the house of Jehu has been ruling in Israel in the north. And you might remember that Jehu began his reign as a seemingly good king. He was a king who did some good things. I mean, he wiped out the house of Ahab. He wiped out the worshipers of Baal. Everything looked like it was going the right direction, but then he ends up following the sins of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, and worshiping at the golden calves in Dan and Bethel. And now his son Jehoash, he's the one in yellow here. His grandson Jehoash is ruling. His son was Jehoahaz. His grandson is Jehoash. And you can kind of see here a little bit of the time frame that we're dealing with. Well, while all this is going on, Elisha's on the scene. So Elisha's on the scene when Jehu is anointed king. And so you could do the math on this. Even if it were the very beginning of Jehoash's reign, 841 minus 798, and someone said this. Someone said, hey, about I think it was your friend who brought this up about the years, that the numbers were going in the wrong direction. And when we're looking at BC, the numbers do go in the wrong direction. As the years go by, the numbers count down. But what didn't happen, just so you guys understand, just so everyone's clear, and I think most of you know this, they weren't counting down to year one. All right, so they just had their own calendar system, and then sometime later on, someone started the numbers over, and all those year numbers changed based on our current system, which is based on when Christ came, even though it's off by a few years. I would argue that it's off by as many as 5 to 8 years. But if you look at this, you're talking 43 years, maybe 50 plus years. Elisha has been on the scene, and Elisha has been God's prophet ministering for a long, long, long time. And now he's an old man, and he's done great and numerous miracles in his days, but the end of his days is upon him. And Elisha grows old, and he gets sick, and it's going to happen. I mean, we might not all get sick. We might not all grow old. But unless the Lord takes us first, it's going to happen to all of us. We're going to grow old, and our bodies are going to break down, and we're going to die. And there's no way to avoid that, unless Christ comes first, or unless some lesser thing happens to us. Believe me, of all the options, you probably want to grow old and die. You don't want to die 25 years old in a car accident, or like this young 17-year-old who got shot last night at Wawa in Stroudsburg. It's crazy, crazy what this town has become and becoming. Well, anyway, the king of Israel we're seeing here, the king of Israel, who is Jehoash, he's not a good king. But even he realizes that someone great and someone influential is about to go the way of all men. So he's realizing, yes, Elisha is something. I may not be faithful to, he may not be serving the Lord, not God's way, but he can recognize that Elisha is a prophet of God. And so he pays Elisha a visit while Elisha's on his deathbed. Verse 14, we're in 2 Kings 13, verse 14. When Elisha became sick with the illness of which he was to die, in other words, we're calling it deathbed. We're saying he's on his deathbed. When Elisha became sick with the illness of which he was to die, Joash, king of Israel, and just so you know, we're dealing with, now on our chart, you'll see on the right side, third king down, you see Joash, but that's Joash, the king of Judah. He's called Joash, he's also called Jehoash. The same on the left. Joash and Jehoash, it's the same name, but we're dealing with the king of Israel here. So that's why I have them highlighted to kind of help you follow. Don't get confused when you're reading through the kings. Pay attention to what they're the king of, whether they're the king of Israel or Judah. And it might not be a bad idea to keep a little timeline. If you need a timeline, send me an email and I'll send you one. It's not perfect, but it's pretty good. And maybe keep that along with you as you read to help you kind of follow along with it. But Joash, the king of Israel, came down to him and wept over him and said, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. Well, that's an interesting phrase for a not-so-great king to use about a prophet of the Lord. Does anyone remember where we've heard that phrase before? Does that ring a bell? That's a pretty big hint. The fact that we've heard it before is a pretty big hint. I know it's a smaller group tonight, but anyone want to take a shot at it? When Elijah was taken up to heaven by a whirlwind. I don't know why it's so funny to say whirlwind, because you know it's a whirlwind, but have you ever heard someone say whirlwind? They say whirlwind, and I made fun of them for so long that I actually say whirlwind because it's funny. I don't know why it's funny, but it's funny to me. Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, and Elisha saw and cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen. And he saw Elijah no more. So the same words that Elisha used about Elijah at his departure from this earth, they're the same words that the king of Israel is using about Elisha. So maybe Elisha told him the account or whatever else. Maybe it's already been recorded at that point. But whatever the case is, it's a phrase of great respect. And the king of Israel recognizes the great impact that Elisha has had. Several times Elisha's protected Israel. Several times he's protected the chariots and its horsemen. But before Elisha goes, he has some words for the king in verses 15 through 17. Elisha said to him, take a bow and arrows. So he took a bow and arrows. That's the first command he gives. Then he said to the king of Israel, put your hand on the bow. And it kind of sounds like how I tell my kids how to do something. So if I tell my kids, hey, listen, I want you to go do this, this, and this, it doesn't get done. Like one of those things gets done, and then they're off doing their thing, and I'm like, hey, did you do these things? Wait, I was supposed to do what? So I'll say, for instance, I'll be like, hey, Josh, come here. And Josh comes, and I wait till he's here, and then I'll say, I'd like you to go do this thing. And he'd be like, he may not have all the pieces of the puzzle together, and he'll be like, okay. And he'll go do the first step in the process. And then I might be like, hey, I'd like you to grab the vacuum cleaner. Okay, he gets the vacuum cleaner. I'll be like, okay, so now I'd like you to take that vacuum cleaner and go in the back and vacuum the back room. And so I'll give instructions. I kind of give instructions like part by, piece by piece, so that they get done, a certain way. Well, it kind of seems like that's what's happening here. He's like, listen, get a bow and some arrows. Okay, I've got the bow and arrows. Put your hand on the bow. Okay. Like step by step. So he took, and he put his hand on it. Then Elisha laid his hands on the king's hands. He said, open the window toward the east, and he opened it. So we kind of have like the third kind of command that Elisha's given him. Then Elisha said, shoot, and he shot. That's 4 different things. And he said, the Lord's arrow of victory, even the arrow of victory over Aram, for you will defeat the Arameans at Aphek until you have destroyed them. So who are the Arameans again? What nation is the same as the Arameans? The Arameans are the same as Syria. I often call them Syria. I think the King James calls them Syria. I think the more modern translations call them the Arameans, but I'm used to calling them the Syrians, and that's what Syria is today, so I still call them the Syrians, even if Aram is what we see in Scripture. But anyway, so, what we have here is a prophecy of Israel defeating its enemies, the Syrians, toward the east, and they certainly are toward the east of the Jezreel Valley and toward the northeast as well. But even on Elisha's deathbed, he's doing the Lord's work. And it makes me think a little bit of, here he is in his last days, he's prophesying. In his last days, he's trying to make a difference with the king of Israel in the north. And it would be nice to see more and more people like that today. We do see people like that today. I mean, I'm looking at Dennis, and I'm looking at how nice Dennis is on his... I wasn't around enough to really see how he was working or if he was ministering the gospel or anything like that with the nurses. I do think of Wayne. And how Wayne was giving people the gospel. Who here knew Wayne? Wayne Enke? Just a few, just a handful. Wayne was on his deathbed, and as long as he was able to talk, he was telling the nurses about the gospel and giving people the gospel right to the very end. And he wanted his family to be saved and to be faithful to the Lord. Again, as I mentioned this morning, I think the more common circumstance is that people just serve the Lord when it's convenient, and they would rather do something else. They'd rather follow the world or whatever. But Elisha does the Lord's work to the very end, till even on his deathbed, if we're calling it his deathbed. And he has one more prophecy for the king in verse 18. Then he said, "Take the arrows," and he took them. And he said to the king of Israel, "Strike the ground." And he struck it 3 times and stopped. So what you have here is you have these arrows. They're a picture of a prophecy that Elisha is making, or something that God is doing for Israel on behalf of Israel. And it seems fairly clear that this picture with the bow and arrows is a sign of some prophecy that's about to be fulfilled. And if you're the king of Israel, you kind of should be able to figure that out. It's easy for us to see because we have hindsight. We read the rest of the passage and then we can kind of look back. If you've never read this passage before, you'll see what I mean in a second. But most likely you've read this passage. Most likely, I would imagine a portion of you have read this passage many times, some maybe 20, 30, 40, 50 times. I don't know. I've got to think I've read it at least 30 times in my life, at least 30 times, so I know the account pretty well. And so we could look back and say, yeah, this is an object prophecy. It's like an object lesson prophecy. And so for us, it doesn't take rocket science to kind of figure that out. The king doesn't seem to quite have it figured out. And so, he shoots an arrow into the ground. This is how I picture it. Now, look, the Bible doesn't tell us this. But I'm using sanctified imagination. That's what we call it. It's called guesswork. All right, but we like to call it sanctified imagination. So I picture him saying, "Hey, shoot an arrow into the ground." And I see the king taking an arrow and striking one into the ground. And I see Elisha there like, is that all? And the king being like, "Oh, okay," and shoots another one into the ground. And Elisha laying on his bed, and it's like, okay, is that all? This is how I'm picturing it. I could be wrong. This may not be anything like what it happened. And then he strikes it a 3rd time and stops. That's how I picture it. Now, if you picture it differently, maybe you're right. We'll never know. But that's how I picture it. I picture it something like that. It could be something like, okay, we're good. I don't know. We just know that he struck it 3 times. He struck the ground 3 times. But Elisha isn't happy when he stops. So the man of God was angry with him and said, "You should have struck 5 or 6 times. Then you would have struck Aram until you would have destroyed it. But now you shall strike Aram only 3 times. You've chosen your own future. You could have completely destroyed the people of Syria and no longer had them as an enemy, but instead, you're only going to defeat them 3 times. In other words, it's like, man, he's one pathetic loser. He could have taken care of these guys. And by the way, if you're paying attention, we already saw in verse 17 the Lord's arrow of victory. The arrows are a picture of the victory that God would give. The king apparently thought 3 was enough. 3 wasn't enough. Elisha is angry because he realizes that this king, this king's not really about the Lord anyway. This king worships a false version of the Lord. He worships the Lord how he wants to worship the Lord. He worships the false golden calves that were set up in Dan and Bethel. He's a bad king. He's a bad king, just like all the kings in the north. He's a bad king. And Elisha sees it, he's angry, and then he dies. It's just not really like how you want it to end. Elisha died, and they buried him. It's the end of a great man of faith. It's the end of a man who made a difference in the world. Elisha is one of the most famous prophets in all of history, and now he's gone. And this is the last thing we see that he said, which kind of shows you something about his heart for Israel, too. He's got a heart for the people of Israel. And he also realizes these kings they're no good. He can recognize when Israel doesn't have a godly person as king, but now he's gone. No more shall his words grace the halls of kings. No more shall his words condemn the sons of man. Elisha was a man of miracles in his life, and he was a man of miracles in his death. And this, what we're about to read, is something very interesting. And for those of you who have read it and who know it, you know what I'm talking about. This is an interesting account. Elisha is a man of miracles in his death. So when I die, I've said this to people, and I made this known to the church, and I've spoken it before the church so that they can hold my wife accountable when it happens, if you're alive when I die. I don't want to be embalmed. I don't want to, what do you call it? Is that what you call it, embalming? I don't want to be embalmed, and I don't want to have my body displayed before the world to see the shell, the imperfect shell that is me. You get to see it every week, okay? And if I didn't have to look at it, I wouldn't look at it either. So I don't want people looking at it when I'm dead. I'm not interested. Sorry, I'm not interested. But what I do want to do is I want to make sure I'm dead. I want you to make absolute sure I'm dead. Put me in the ground and give me like a cell phone, or put a booster on top of the grave, or put like they did in the old days, that have a bell up there and a cord going down. And if I end up not actually being dead, I could sit there and ring that bell, and then someone, come and dig me up before it's over. I don't want to be displayed. Just make sure I'm dead and put me in the ground. Maybe a cell phone, maybe like a burner phone or something like that. Give me a few days. A burner phone would probably do. Can you get reception? John, would you get reception in the ground 6 feet under? I don't know. Anyone know that? Andrew? Oh yeah, the concrete. Yeah, well, it is what it is. So anyway, if you threw me in the ground and you took my body and they just put me in wherever they're going to put it, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to happen. In fact, if you were to go to a morgue or something like that, they're very careful about. I've been there. I've seen the process. I had to do that for a seminary project, and they're very careful about cleanliness and cleaning their hands and keeping the place clean and stuff like that. The only thing you might have to worry about is disease, really, when it comes to handling my body. That's what's going to happen when you handle my body. That's not what happened with Elisha's body. So check this out in verse 20 and 21. So Elisha died, and they buried him. Now the bands of the Moabites would invade the land in the spring of the year, and they were burying a man. So what I have here is these Moabites. So what happens? Let me show you what's going on. So Moab is kind of off to the east of the Dead Sea area, and that land is kind of dead. There's not really a whole lot over there. Anything east of the Transjordanian mountains is just kind of death. There just isn't a whole lot of rain east of that area. You just kind of and plus the stuff that's right down here in the dead. It's all dead. It's all dead land down there. Believe me, I've been through it. It's Middle Eastern desert. what I would call desolate. It's not like the pictures of a desert where there's sandy dunes and like in Tatooine or something like that. It's more like maybe the rocky part of Tatooine. Remember the beginning of Star Wars when the droids were? It's just like rocky. It's just like rocks everywhere, and it's just like kind of like brown rocks everywhere. Well, when you're down here in this desert land, you don't have a whole lot of resources, and so in the spring, the armies would go out to fight. You might remember David. Remember David in the spring of the year, the kings went out to battle, but David did not go with them. Remember what happened with David? Anyone remember what happened with David when the kings went out to fight at the spring of the year? What did David do? He stayed home and did what? He stayed home and looked at girly magazines, basically. He stayed home and he watched a girl bathing on a roof. And we have some comments we made about that back at the time. Was that intentional? Was she trying to get the king's attention? We don't know that for sure. We don't know one way or the other. But he was a voyeurist. Is that what it is? Maybe that's the opposite. I don't know. He liked to look at naked people. And he was looking at this woman, and what did that lead to? That led to an affair. It led to an affair, which led to a pregnancy, which led to a murder, which led to the death of the baby, which led to being called out in front of the nation by Nathan the prophet. Thou art the man, remember? It was a mess. It was an absolute mess, which led to judgment, which led to blood not leaving his house. So that was a big, ugly mess. But in the spring of the year, the kings would go out to battle, and the people from Moab, they would go in and they're running out of resources in this dry area. So the bands of the Moabites would kind of go in to Israel and they would steal resources. That's kind of what would happen. So that's a little bit of the background of what's going on. And right now, Moab was always under the authority of Israel and Judah. But you might remember a little while ago, we talked about a king of the Moabites called Elisha. Anyone remember that name, Elisha? Does that stand out from the Moabite stele? Elisha was kind of like a powerful king of Moab who kind of brought Moab back. Well, here they need resources. When we come back to this passage, so Elisha died and they buried him. Now the bands of the Moabites would invade the land in the spring of the year. It was the time for war. The spring was a time for war because, listen, when it was hard to fight during the winter rains, and it's hard to fight during the later harvest because they'd be working the field and stuff like that. So what they would do is they would fight after the winter rains and before the harvest. That was the spring of the year. That's when they fought. And that was the easiest time to move armies. You could read about that in the annals of the Assyrian and Babylonian, of their records. They talk about that a little bit. But anyway, this Israelite man, I know it doesn't necessarily read so easily like that, because you see the band of the Moabites would invade the land in the spring of the year. And as they were burying a man, and I have they being Israelites. I have they being Israelites and not Moabites. Some people could read they as Moabites, but I have them being Israelites because they see the marauding band coming. That's how I have it. Does that make sense? Make sense? I suppose you could make a different argument, but I think you're wrong. I think they are Israelites. As they were burying a man, behold, they saw a marauding band of Moabites who would invade the land in the spring of the year. This is sometime after Elisha's death. Well, hold on, let's finish reading. And they cast the man into the grave of Elisha, and when the man touched the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. That's why I wanted the cell phone. No. So what happens here is Elisha's dead. I'm going to argue. So this is how it works. So let's imagine that you have a slab here, and then you have a slab here, and a slab here, and then you have holes in the wall here, and you have holes in the wall over here. And then there's a little doorway back in this corner. maybe, or it could be any corner. And it would lead to another chamber back there where they would throw the bones. Now, you're not taking a dead body and throwing it back in here. You're not going to, it's hard to get in there and drag a body through that antechamber into the back where the bones are laid. What you do is you take the body and you lay it on a slab like this. You lay it on the slab, and then in about a year's time, that body decomposes down to its bones, something like that. Then you measure the longest bone, which is the femur, and they would build a box, and they would take all your bones and they would stick it in that box. That box is called an ossuary, and they would slide that box in one of those slots in the wall. When those slots fill up, they would take the ossuary out and they would take it back into that chamber and they would throw the bones back in that chamber, something like that. Does that make sense? So if that's what happens, about how long after Elisha's death would we think this would have happened? Would we think it would be 20 years later? Or hundreds of years later? I'm going to argue within about a year or so. Before they take the bones, I suppose it could have been longer depending on how much space is in the tomb. But I'm going to argue somewhere in the range of a year when the bones are sitting there on a slab. That's my argument. And I'm going to argue that they bring the man in and they sit him on a slab and his body touches the bones that are left of Elisha's bones. And if it were my bones, nothing would happen. The guy would be dead, and he would stay dead. And that would be that. But these were Elisha's bones, and they put their fallen comrade's dead body in the tomb of Elisha, and it touches Elisha's bones, and when his dead body, which no longer has life in it, touches the bones of Elisha, he revived and stood up on his feet. And so even in death, Elisha's carrying out great miracles. Now, did Elisha do that miracle? Could Elisha's dead bones revive the other guy's body? Obviously we know that could not happen because it's just bones. God did it. Dead bones can't do anything. God did the miracle. But the idea that's here is that not even death stops Elisha's work. Not even death stops it. Everything that Elisha did lives on in this world. All of his words will come to pass. Elisha may be dead, but God isn't. God isn't. And it's a little something, just a little something of a picture of the coming resurrection. That guy touches Elisha's bones and he comes back to life. But he's going to die. That guy dies again eventually. He dies. We're all going to die. But those who trust in the Lord and in his Messiah, they will be raised to life everlasting and they'll never die again. And Jesus says that. And after he says it, he says, "Do you believe me? Do you believe this?" You'll have permanent resurrection. You'll be given a resurrected body, and you'll be in God's presence for all of eternity. Anyway, at this point, we come back to this prophecy. It's just kind of like almost a parenthesis. That's kind of how when I'm looking at this passage, I have the account going through verse 20, the first part of verse 20, and then I have 22 and 23. But this whole thing is kind of like, hey, by the way, let me tell you something crazy. Let me tell you something cray-cray that happened. Something like that. So we come back to Elisha's prophecy about Israel and Syria in verses 22 and 23. Now Hazael, king of Syria, king of Aram, had oppressed Israel all the days of Jehoahaz. And remember where we are. Jehoahaz was the king before our current king. So Hazael, the king of Syria, he had oppressed Israel during all those days. But the Lord was gracious. The Lord was gracious to them and had compassion on them and turned to them because of his covenant Look at this. Look at why. Because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and would not destroy them or cast them from his presence until now. This is why he didn't destroy them. It's because of his covenant with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. He could have destroyed them. They deserved to be destroyed, but instead he had compassion on them. He had compassion on them. And then Israel had a certain amount of success against Syria, but only 3 times. When Hazael, king of Aram, died, Ben-Hadad, his son, became king in his place. Does anyone remember what was interesting about Hazael and his son, Ben-Hadad? Anyone remember the point we made last week about these 2 guys? Someone new tonight? Anyone remember? Anyone? There's so many people here to call on. He's a real son of Hadad, yeah. For those of you at home who should be here right now, actually, by the way. You should be here. Little shade to you guys at home. But anyway, what she said, what did you say again? No. What she said was, Hazael killed his master, Ben-Hadad, and then named his son Ben-Hadad, which is like, my son's the real son of Hadad. I killed that son of Hadad. Hadad is like the false, he's like the Syrian version of Baal. So when Hazael, king of Aram, died, Ben-Hadad, his son, became king in his place. See, listen, there's stuff to be learned. This is good stuff to, if you're taking notes. The thing is, the crazy part is you'll take those notes and then you go back years later and be like, what was I thinking when I took half those notes? So take good notes because I don't understand my own notes half the time. But anyway, then Jehoash, so now we've moved up to this king right now, Jehoash, to the king we're in right now, the king who shot the arrows into the ground. Then Jehoash, the son of Jehoahaz, took again from the hand of Ben-Hadad, the son of Hazael, the cities which he had taken in the war from the hand of Jehoahaz his father. 3 times Joash defeated him. It's the same king. 3 times Joash defeated him and recovered the cities of Israel. And so you have this ongoing Syro-Ephraimite war, basically the Syrians fighting, and we remember. I don't think you guys can see the name of the city. Can you see the name of the city? You can see it. You can see that. Yeah. Okay. I thought it was small enough to where you can't see it. Can you see the name of that city in the back? You can't see it back there. See, you got to sit in the front. You'd see it. So I guess you're just not going to know what the name is. But anyway. But the ones in the front, you guys know the name of it. Ramoth-Gilead. You might remember them fighting over Ramoth-Gilead. And there's some other towns thereabouts that Israel was able to recover again against the Syrians. But unfortunately, and they had some more peace, because what actually happens here is you have this major, we talked about him last week, this major cat called Assyria, and they're coming against the Syrians and distracting the Syrians away from Israel. And while the Syrians are being distracted by the big cat in the northeast, Assyria, then Israel, right here, this little mouse, Israel's able to kind of recover some of that land that the Syrians had taken from them. 3 times, that's what happened. So a little bit of an historical look at that scenario. In this passage, we see the end of the life of Elisha. His final acts were acts of prophecy. On his deathbed, he's warning Israel of coming judgment. After his death, we see God working through his dead body, through his bones. And what we see throughout the 2 Kings passage is the great life of Elisha and how God was able to work through this prophet, and that Elisha's words, which are God's words, will come to pass. But we also get a little bit of a sense of impending doom for the nation of Israel. Look, Elisha's gone. When Elijah died, who took his place? Elisha. When Elisha's gone, there's no one that takes his place. There's no one that takes his place. And if, I don't know if I have, let me take a look here. Yeah, we're going to the end here. If you look here, 782, the end of Joash's reign, down to 722, what's that, 60 years? And 60 years, Israel is no more. The opposition in this passage, I didn't have it up here. These Assyrians who are up here, they're the guys who are going to come in and wipe out Israel. For now, they're giving Israel a little bit of a reprieve against the Syrians. But in 60 years, they're going to take the Israelites captive and destroy Samaria. It won't be long before God's patience with Israel runs out. It won't be long before Israel is destroyed, before they're taken away by the Assyrians. And that's because Israel has not repented. They haven't turned to the Lord. They aren't really listening to his prophets. They aren't really obeying his prophets. And so in a mere 60 years, Israel's destroyed. But Elisha is a great man of God. And God works through him. And God continues to work today, not through prophets, but he works. God worked through Elisha, but Elisha is nothing compared to Jesus Christ. Elisha was only great because God is great. Elisha was only great because God made him great, but he's just a man. God loved us so much that he sent his son. His own son, his one-of-a-kind son, and his own son took our place, and he suffered and died on the cross in our place, on our behalf, to pay the penalty of our sins, a penalty we could never pay. Jesus worked greater wonders than Elisha could ever work, and he did the work. Elisha didn't do the work. God did the work. Jesus Christ did the great wonders, and he died, and he rose again, and through him we can have everlasting life. And so we need to place our trust in God's great work through the Messiah. And we'll receive the blessings of everlasting life. We won't see the hand of judgment come upon us. We need to look at his truth, hear his truth, obey his truth, and commit our lives to his Son. I'd like to have you take your hymnals and turn to 639. We're going to close our service with a hymn. If you're not sure